name is Michael Albert, and I am the host of the podcast that's titled Revolution Z. This is our 331st consecutive episode, and our guest this time is Stephen Lerner. Stephen is a labor and community organizer who has spent more than 4 decades organizing hundreds of thousands of janitors, uh, farm workers, garment workers, and other low wage workers into unions, resulting in increased wages, first time health benefits, paid sick days, and other improvements on the job. He was the director of SEIU's Property Service Division, served on SEIU's International Executive Board, and is the architect of the Justice for Janitors campaign. Stephen has published numerous articles charting a path for the 21st century labor movement, able to break the stranglehold Wall Street and big banks have on our economy and democracy. Most recently, he has written about resisting Trump, and it was my seeing such an article that propelled me to invite Stephen to be with us today. So, Stephen, honored to meet you and welcome to Revolution Z.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
To start, before we get to what is needed from labor, and in general for that matter, can you give us a feeling for what labor, whether organized or not, has been doing so far regarding Trump, Musk at all? Just a feeling, an overview. Where are things at in labor?
Well, I think it's really mixed and it's uneven. And some of the most exciting work is what's happening with big local unions. That I think we've seen in the case of federal workers, they've joined together in an organization called FUND, the Federal Unionist Network, which is taking all different federal unions and working together on how we
Hmm.
fight back. You see, the American Association of University Professors are leading key battles at universities, both about academic freedom, but also how they shouldn't crumble on the threat of money being taken out of their budgets. You see that AFT has been using the American Federation of Teachers. I should stay away from all these initials. The American
Yeah.
Association of University Professors is the AAUP, and the American Federation of Teachers has started raising the question about why are pension funds invested in Tesla when their stock is tanking, that it's a lousy investment. And then this weekend on April 5th, there's demonstrations planned around the country. On April 17th, there's higher ed. So I'd say that I think one way to think about it is people are revving their motors, they're getting ready. There's not been that much dramatic, but I think we're heading into a moment where you're going to see a lot more activity. And one of the things we're building towards is big May Day demonstrations. And there's actually a call tonight at 5 o'clock Eastern for folks who want to get on to hear about it. So there's a lot of stuff brewing, but not nearly enough, and not nearly militant enough, and not targeted enough yet.
Huh. All right. Well, that does lead into just exactly the kinds of things that I think we need to talk about. Let me ask you a question, though, still about what is happening or has happened till now. I was struck, saddened, depressed when the UAW issued its statement about Trump's tariff policies, etc. I understand it, but um, I was surprised. I thought Sean Fain would simply balk right from the start, but he didn't seem to. And I wonder if you had a similar feeling about that, or if you have an explanation of it that will re- reduce my concern.
Well, I don't know you well enough to know whether I can reduce your concern. I think it's really complicated in that auto workers have been so devastated over the
Yeah.
last 20 and 30 years as other industrial workers. So I understand when the auto workers say, we should have protected the auto industry 30 years ago. And so I
Yeah.
understand that instinct, and why folks would say that. But simultaneously, and this is what I write about in this article, Caution for Labor is Fatal, is that Trump is very, very skilled at trying to split people. And, he'll be good to some and not to others. So I understand why the UAW said it. I'm sympathetic, but I think for those of us who are in the movement, we need to be clear headed about the goals of the Trump Musk axis, and it's to destroy unions. And that's what we have to focus on in the long run. So I think there's going to be lots of bumps in the road, but what we have to look to is a broad alignment of forces that are committed to both fighting for economic justice, democracy, and challenging this whole cabal of, high tech. I mean, we really have to. What we really have to. I think a lot of people haven't realized yet is a lot of people view this as just a billionaire takeover, but it's more than that. It's these folks in Silicon Valley who literally publicly say they believe we need a CEO monarchy to
Yeah.
run the country. And so I think we need to sort of have a deeper analysis. The billionaires are always trying to get more money, and they will. But what this is about is billionaires, the fossil fuel industry, the high tech Silicon Valley industry, all joining together to try to really dominate every aspect of the country. So all of these layoffs in the public sector, we all know where that's going. They're then going to turn around and say, well, we need to privatize the work.
Yeah.
What they're really adopting, the Chicago Teachers Union had a really good expression that they actually started using under Rahm Emanuel and other people, which is broke on purpose. It's where you purposely
Oh,
break,
oh, yeah. Yeah.
broke on purpose. It's where you purposely underfund things or do things that make them non-functioning, and then you see it doesn't work. So that's what they're doing now at Social Security, at the IRS. I don't know if it's weeks or months, but at some point Elon Musk and other characters are going to say, well, just give me a contract and I'll get it done. I think
Yeah.
what's happening at this moment is that they are trying to figure out every different way to extract wealth from workers and every different way that they can increase their power. And so I think we, labor and the broader movement, needs to be clear on what their goals are. And then we need to start developing plans and strategies that meet this moment, not the moment of 10 years ago.
Agreed. I still was surprised by Sean Fain. And then he introduced uh, Sanders in a gigantic Detroit rally, redeeming things some for me. But was it that is he confused? Or is he just so much internal pressure that he felt he had to do that and
I,
then he can move
I'm not
on?
I'm not in the auto workers union. I don't know the details of the
Yeah.
deliberations. Um, what I do understand, though, is that a lot of auto workers have seen their standard of living be screwed. They've seen their plants shut down. And so it is tempting when somebody says, aha, I'm going to save you, for people to be drawn to that. I think part of our job is to help people. I was in a meeting in Brazil a couple of years ago, and somebody in the meeting said, we have industry unions, meaning an auto union or a steel union, to raise wages by sector, but we have a labor movement to fight for the whole working class. So I think this is going to happen a bunch of times that certain unions will make peace or do something because they see it as an opportunity. That may be right, that may be wrong. But what's important for the rest of us to do is say, we have to fight for the whole working class and figure out how we do that. And there will be bumps in the road and we won't always agree. But I think one of the things we have to avoid is not getting into sort of pissing matches on our side that aren't going to improve things. And so I guess what I'd say is he's figuring out his union and what he has to do. What I'm focused on is how we work with anybody who wants to work together to figure out how we build a movement that's capable of stopping these characters.
Yeah, and in your introduction, not introduction, but the first question, sort of situating what was going on, it was evident because the examples you gave, I'm sure there are many things that you could have mentioned, but you consistently mentioned uh, cross, I don't know what to call it, larger than unit functioning alliances, um, and agree with you completely. But in practice, what does it mean? So when Musk and Trump say you're fired to a few thousand employees of a particular division, one approach is for the employees to think, okay, what can we, just us, do? And their answer appears to be pretty much leave, as compared to what can we all do? What is the correct response to being fired by a lunatic who has no rights in any sensible formulation of what's going on? Um, should we sit down? Should we not leave? Should we call upon other unions to help us? I'm not sure I'm seeing that, and yet your little introduction suggested that's already beginning to happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is more and more connection between federal unions and other public sector unions. But I want to just go backwards a second because I think
Okay.
a lot of people's instinct are we should go protest at a government building or we should do something at
Yeah.
the government building. I That's fine if you do it, but the real strategy has to be it's how do we figure out not just Musk, but the whole grouping of billionaires
Yeah.
behind this, and then how do we cost them money? So it's fine to get in front of the building and have a big rally, but that's good to build spirit, and we should do that. But what many of us are focused on, Tesla stock is way down, their sales are down 13%, looking at a whole set of billionaires. And let's hold them accountable. A lot of these billionaires who are behind this get money from our public employee pension plans. There's $6 trillion of workers' money in public employee pension plans. And it's insane that many of them are invested in the very people that are dedicated to defunding the public sector. And so I think one of the things that we really need to think about is this is not a political, we're not going to influence Republican politicians. They're not going to be moved if we do a demonstration at them. What's going to move people is if the billionaires behind this start to feel economic and other impact, they lose money for investment. If their businesses start to hurt, then that causes a kind of cleavage between the ruling groups that allows us to do something. And I think they would love us to keep just doing demos at government buildings. We need to be at the businesses, at the offices, at the homes of the people who have dedicated themselves to enriching themselves by screwing the rest of us. And I think that's sort of where we need to get to.
It's the tried and true approach that you have to raise the social costs to the elites high enough so that, well, it's no longer in their interest to pursue the policies that they were pursuing because it's hurting them too much. I agree, but what would you say to someone who says, hold on, Trump's going to fire Musk? In fact, he's going to replace any of these guys, and he doesn't really care that much about anything except a large, militant, popular base, uh, and seizing every form of authoritarian control that he can.
Well,
Now,
but
that
he's
might not be a good strategy for him, but it might be what he's doing.
right, but that works because so far everybody's not really opposed it. Wall Street hasn't opposed it, big companies, because their greed is so great. But there's lots of examples throughout that they sort of get seduced by it. But
Yeah.
when the stock market's down, I don't know, 1,500 points today, that as demonstrations grow, as there's more civil disobedience, as there's more disruption, then excuse me, that's when we have to think about, like, I'm to some extent, Trump is a vehicle for people to do this. But if Trump was just on his own and all these folks abandoned him, it would be a totally different play. And so, again, what I think Trump would like and what all of them would like is for us to continue to say it's so unfair, let's go protest at their buildings. But we have to name and go after the billionaires. We have to, and let me just give you a specific example of something. We could calculate in any state how much the billionaires are going to save in tax breaks, right? You could say in a state like Connecticut, where I don't remember, there's 25 billionaires. You could calculate how much they're going to save. And we could start moving right now on a state level to say any new income or wealth that they get from these tax cuts, while the state's budget's going to be cut, that we're going to 100% tax it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we need to do. We need to not be into sort of there's
Or,
nothing we can do.
or to do that anyway, but
Well, absolutely, we should do it on a state level, but there's such a sweet logic for folks who are not necessarily for taxing the rich of saying they just got hundreds of billions of dollars while we're getting less. So,
take
absolutely,
it
we need
back.
to tax the rich, but the idea of taking it back, that these are, but all over the country, what's really exciting is people are starting to form things to look at much more creative ways to tax them. We have an idea that in bargaining for common good we've worked on, which is a digital ad tax. And Maryland's already doing it. You can tax each Microsoft Google ad at the source and raise billions in revenue. They make money off of our data. we can reclaim some of that money by taxing them. So I think one of the things we need to look at
So
is
this is at the state level, or
at the state level. Yes, yeah, and
huh?
Maryland's already passed it, and most of the money's going to schools. They're suing to get the money back. But I think part of what we have to free ourselves up to say is many things that seemed impossible in the past, the very aggressiveness and outrageousness of what the billionaires are doing opens a door for us to do things we couldn't do in the past. And I think that's one of the challenges, how people get out of the fetal position, how people get out of, oh, he's flooding the field, there's so much going on. And I think, the Wisconsin election partly shows it on the Supreme Court that there's a growing feeling that these aren't just billionaires, but they're whiny, spoiled brats. It just is extraordinary that the richest people in the world spend all their time talking about how unfairly they're treated. And I think as more damage happens to regular people, as people lose benefits, they see the attacks, more and more folks are going to say, it's not just unfair, but it's obscene that these guys, and I'm really struck, maybe it's just me, but they're whiny. They're like crybabies. Musk is out there saying, oh, poor me. Why would they be mean to me? They have no sense of how they're seen. So I think, I don't know if it's months, weeks, how long it is, but I think we're going to see more and more people not just taking to the streets, but also taking to understanding how these companies make their money and saying, we're going to try to stop that until we get some justice here.
What about the fear factor? So when Trump comes down on Colombia, these aren't poor, um, powerless people who he's threatening. Uh, it's and the same with the giant law firm, and that two of them rolled over so quickly. That's hard to it's. Is it an unadmitted self interest? I don't think so. It seems to be fear. And
Well,
the
yeah.
same thing holds true for all the Republican senators and Congress people. I mean, lots of them, they seem to be afraid of him.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And, one of the things that's sort of both shocking but really educational is how quickly these
It's
elite
incredible.
institutions are caving and on free speech on everything. But for many years we have to remember that higher ed has been commodified long ago. The joke is that Harvard and Columbia and all these schools are basically hedge funds and private equity funds that teach on the side. That they've already made a decision when you look at who are on the board of trustees, that these are institutions that already chose that their primary mission is to have as big as an endowment as they can and raise all this money. And so one, I'm not actually that surprised because they've sort of showed this behavior for years that their primary goal was to sort of make the university more influential and richer. And I think it's actually useful for us to understand that people that we may have thought were so-called liberal and allies, in fact, they're just opportunists too. Why are the law firms doing it? Because they want to make money. They're
Yeah.
completely unprincipled. And so, I think when I look back at history, this is what often happens, which is, and this is what happens in fascism, institutions cave first. And part of our job then is to help people get over the fear by being fearless. And there's
Yeah.
no magic to that. It's not a video. It's like we have to demonstrate through our actions and our words that we're fearless. And if we're fearless, that will inspire other people. And that's why in the article I talk about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because in the heart of Jim Crow's segregated South, they inspired a nation by taking incredible risks, by sitting in, by getting arrested. And I think those kind of heroic moments are how we shift the fear and get people to go from fear to bravery.
You're seeing, you report, the beginnings and even some real momentum in labor movement as compared to individual or even single industry responses. What about on this other axis? Are you seeing, I don't know how to describe it, um, fear on the left or, that courageousness on the left? It's again not clear when you're looking at things by looking at media, even alternative media, et cetera, et cetera. You get a feeling that it may be the former.
I,
Um,
I absolutely agree that our side, whether you want to call it the left, progressive, sort of the liberal
Right.
left, however you define it, that fear has dominated a lot of the
Yeah,
dialogue of what people are doing. Now, some of that, especially for immigrants and undocumented folks, is totally understandable, and that's exactly why they're picking people up,
of
because
course.
immigrant workers have been some of the biggest organizers and leading so many movements. So absolutely, there's huge fear, and I think there's fear of any institution, whether it be a union or a university or a foundation that has financial resources, because that's what they're going to try to do is cut off the financial resources. Whether in whatever way they do that. So I see the fear, and I think it's starting. What I'd say in the fear is I can feel it sort of receding a little bit, and I think it's receding for two reasons. One, because people are realizing that
Doesn't work.
it doesn't work. I mean,
Yeah,
one is to be driven by fear means to give up. We just
yeah,
might as well give up. But the other thing is, you know, as an organizer, what I see is anytime you organize workers in a factory or janitors, you start off with fear. The employer campaign is if you join the union, you'll either get fired, I'll close the plant, I'll somehow punish you. And the hard work is forming a committee. And then some people aren't afraid. And then they stand up and that inspires other people. And so I think that's the moment we're in. I think the Tesla takedown stuff is the great example of this. They've said they're going to do terrorism charges and they're going to get people, but they just keep growing around the world because people are furious. So I think part of what we need to do in the left and in the labor movement is offer people targets, places they can do things that are not just performative and marching in circles, but have a real impact. And we've done that in the past. In the Justice for Janitors campaign, we fought many of these same billionaires with immigrant workers, and we were able, through a combination of strikes, through a combination of economic leverage, winning public support, to beat some of the biggest, richest people in the country with the poorest workers. So I feel totally confident if we get over our fear, if we're able to be focused and targeted, and we have both a strategy and a vision of where we want to go, that we're not just going to turn this back, but we have an opportunity. And I think this is a key thing. There's many folks on the sort of, I don't know if we call it more liberal side, that would be happy to go back to where it was 10 years
yeah.
ago. That cannot be what we want. We will lose every worker in the country if we're saying let's go back. We have to say we need to go forward to something new and better. We're not having a war with the billionaires to go back to the unacceptable level of inequality. We need to have a war with the billionaires about the kind of country we're going to have that creates opportunity and hope for lots of people, not just for the super rich.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't see how we could agree more, but,
But if you want to fight, give me something we could
yeah, I'm
disagree on.
trying, I'm trying.
Oh, you're fine, but it's like it's so clear to
Not to
me.
fight, but to,
Oh, I know.
yeah,
Yeah,
it is so clear. I mean, that's maybe one of the striking things. It is so clear, and yet there's the hesitance, and there's the I mean, for example, the nonprofits who are progressive. I mean, there's some who aren't, but the ones who are and whose people are, are committed to good things are also running incredibly scared, I think. And the fear is exaggerated. That is to say, the other side isn't ready to take out 10,000 nonprofits. It's, maybe one here, one there, but it's not. And on the other hand, the minute that one falls down, the minute that the law firm gives in, that first one, other law firms, well, look, I can give in too now. I'm not the first one. I'm not the one who, dropped the ball. They did, and I can protect our income, not law, not justice, not anything else, our income, as you described. Um, and I'll get away with it. My kids maybe won't won't be sickened by their parents' behavior. It's not unreal. Uh, so
and,
I don't really know. I mean, as someone who writes a lot, it has felt to me. See what you think of this. Like presenting over and over how bad Trump is, or Trump and company are. Um, Presenting over and over the pain and the suffering that they will induce. I mean, it's not worthless, but there is so much of it already, including in the mainstream, that the obstacle to greater civil disobedience, to greater strategic commitment, to et cetera, is not ignorance of what's going on. That's
But,
not it anymore.
but
Uh,
you
it's a
know,
feeling that nothing better can be attained. It's exactly what you said when you said, if we fight to go back where we were, we're going to lose every worker. A lot of people don't understand that, but I think it's absolutely right.
one of the dangers for us is, I don't know if you've ever heard the burning oil platform metaphor, but if you're in the middle of the ocean on an oil platform that's burning, and then you see there's a school of sharks swimming around it. What do you do? Do you burn to death or do you jump and get eaten by sharks? And I think that's often how we present things. It's so
Right.
bad, it's so bad.
Yeah.
And what I was struck, in this article I wrote was how many people got back to me and said, "Oh, there's hope. It's not so bad." And I think that's got to be part of our job. And I think the point you're making, sort of the unending litany of, like, I don't even talk about Trump anymore. I rarely use his name. That what we have to focus on is what we have in our control, and also this question of what it is we want.
Yeah.
What is the world we want, and what's a strategy to get there? And I just think people are waiting for that. There's enormous energy out there that we can tap, but we have to get out of this trap that this is, to me, the three things that terrify me most is the folks who say, let's just focus on 20 on 26. We're going to take it all back then. Just terrifies me
Yeah.
because, you know, all that strategy is let's limit the damage.
Yeah.
That's that strategy. But the other thing that I think we have to accept is that whether it's law firms, whether it's universities, whether in some case it's unions, institutions with lots of resources are going to be incredibly cautious, which is why I think we need to build this from the bottom.
Yeah.
We need to build it from the folks who, in some cases, have less to lose. And I'm actually sympathetic, having, been part of running a big union that has pension funds and all these assets. You feel an obligation to try to protect them from your members. I totally get it. It's not that that's wrong. It's just that it's insufficient. So,
Yeah.
like, our job is, and this is what we're starting to do around the country. Last year in Minnesota, a group of unions and community groups worked together to get all their contracts to expire at the same time. Thousands of people struck at the same time. They had demands that were created not just by unions, but unions and community groups. And they won incredible stuff, not just at the bargaining table, but for the folks who don't know, Minnesota, with a one vote legislative majority, passed some of the best legislation in the country. And
Yeah.
they demonstrated that when folks do things together, when they build power, that we can win. And I think we need to start showing that. And I think a lot of people are really inspired, how quickly the Tesla stuff took off. And so we need to find other equivalents of Tesla that we can work on.
Yeah. I don't know whether, have you been aware of some of the stuff that's going on in Serbia? It's massive outpourings.
I mean, generally, but not
Well,
in.
the thing that's striking, if the people I've talked to are accurate, and I don't know that for sure, but I think they are, is that it's not seasoned leftists. It's not people who have activist experience, and yet it's stopping the whole country. I don't know whether it's still going or not, but it had people on campuses marching into rural areas collectively to demonstrate that it was possible to fight, and rural communities were putting them up in their homes. Things like that were going on, and it wasn't the left. It was strange. It was partly nationalist, take our country, Serbia, back from these kleptomaniacs who are stealing it from us. It was partly resistance. It was partly, but it wasn't ideological. And I have a feeling that something like that is going on in the US, not as striking as that, but that the motion right now and that the energy right now is among a sector of social democrats, a sector of just the population that are getting more and more angry and militant about it and feeling militant about it, whereas the left, gets depressed.
Well, it's interesting because when you look at, one thing that a lot of folks don't know is yes, we have a lot of federal employees in the Washington, D.C. area, but there's lots of red states that have huge percentages of public employees. I think Ogden, Utah has the highest percentage of federal employees. And then, so when you look at places that,
How is that? I mean, I'm just curious.
oh, I think there's like a big call center. I mean, there's various things that were built there,
Okay.
that, in
Okay.
the same way, but Huntsville, Alabama, huge number of public employees.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that's starting to happen is these places that sort of were either not that political or conservative, you know, they're all of a sudden being zapped. And it's not, and one of the things people are starting to argue, and I think is really effective, is it's not just the impact on a university when you take away half a billion dollars of money, but it ripples. It's like $1.5 billion of stimulus that is taken out of the economy. It ripples out, and so I think as these cuts start to impact communities that thought they were immune, that exactly what you said is right. People who have never been active, people who don't see themselves as activists are, they're starting off showing up at some of the Republican town halls, but now they're showing up at Tesla. And more people are going to show up. And going back to your fear question, as people show up, it gets people over
It
their fear.
declines.
And so it sort of feeds off of each other. But I think you're completely right that that's why, in a crazy way, this is an opportunity to build something much bigger than we had in the past, because the agenda of these billionaires is so clearly at odds with the rest of the country. And maybe, one of the things that I've heard for years, and I'm sure you've heard it, that's made me crazy, is all these rich guys saying we should run the government like a business. Well, we're now running the government like a business. We're laying people off with no notice. We're actually doing to federal employees what would be illegal in the private sector because of the WARN Act. And so I sort of, there's a terrific irony to the same people arguing we should run it like a business. Now that they're doing that, they're going to expose how absurd it is. The government isn't a business, and it does something different. And then the other thing, we start all these
Hello?
people.
A business isn't a business
Right,
in your
exactly.
sense. Right.
But the other thing that's crazy on this is they all these guys running around about the federal deficit. Trump and all these people run their companies at huge, with huge loans. That's how they operate.
Yeah.
So, you know, the hope, and I need to be honest for anybody listening to this who may say, "What the hell's with this guy? How can he be optimistic?" So I am biogenetically, chemically optimistic. That is my nature. But that's how I've stayed an organizer for almost 50 years. But it's not just my biochemical thing. I've seen again and again, in the Justice for Janitors campaign, when the police attacked us in 1990 and two women in LA, we were attacked and two women miscarried and one person died and people were hospitalized. And everybody was like, how do we survive this? And then it's like a day later, it totally turned around because the whole world was shocked by what was caught on video. And the Danish Janitors Union threatened to go on strike and to support US janitors. It's the intensity of conflict that ultimately liberates people to have a different kind of view and a fight, because that conflict sort of shows which side everybody's on.
As long as the conflict can't be blamed on, craziness on the left, that's a strike
Well,
problem. It's a serious danger.
but it's interesting when you say that, because during the Justice for Janitors campaign in DC, after years of organizing and workers being fired and strikes, and when we were under all sorts of court injunctions limiting what we could picket, we did something, which is we parked a school bus across the 14th Street Bridge and did not fully understand the impact of traffic and basically shut the district down. Supreme Court didn't open late. And everybody's saying, is there going to be a backlash? Is it going to backfire? But because we had spent a long time getting people to understand how terrible the conditions of janitors were, and how, like, literally the richest people in Washington were trying to maintain janitors at minimum wage, we were able to do stuff that seemed very militant and aggressive because we laid out a bigger story about why. It wasn't like we randomly
Yeah.
disrupted.
Yeah.
And, it's the same thing in Silicon Valley. We were under court orders saying we couldn't picket any of the Silicon Valley factories. So we blocked the intersection. I mean, we blocked the ramp on the highway. It had more impact than picketing, but it was, a misdemeanor, blocking traffic,
Whatever, right.
but it had a bigger impact than if we walked in a circle in front of it. So part of what we have to do is say, how do we do things that have impact, but also that people understand why we're doing it? It's not random disruption.
Yeah, it's
It
the there should be two criteria. We're going to do an action. We want it to be impactful. We want it to raise costs for the other side, et cetera, et cetera. And we want it to grow our support.
exactly.
And as long as grow our support is serious and in mind, then exactly what you described is what emerges, a militant, civil disobedient, disruptive act, which, however, has been properly motivated and properly discussed, and so people side with it. But that doesn't always happen, and so it is important that that does happen.
And there will be,
Uh,
and we should also, these are crazy, unprecedented time. There will be people that do things that are stupid. Um, but
it's
let's also
going to
go back.
happen.
Yeah, and that's, to me, we just roll with it. We don't need to get defensive. It's a big country, a lot of people, but we should also remember, everybody sort of now, Martin Luther King is a hero, but during the height of the civil rights movement, he was not a hero to all these folks.
Right.
And there was huge criticism of the civil rights movement for being too militant and aggressive. So we need to sort of weigh how we build, support, and grow, but also do things that really have an impact or an effective. Because the thing
Right.
where we'll lose people is if we're just a round of big demonstrations that don't really have a target or a purpose. People feel good and we should do it, but it's insufficient if it's not focused at the right folks in the right
I
way.
I used to say, look, if we bring 100,000 people to Washington, and then we do it again 3 weeks later, and then we do it again 3 weeks later, and every time it's 100,000 people, the cost to the government is cleaning up the area where we assembled, and that's it.
That's
If we
exactly
bring
right.
20,000 and then 40,000 and then 80,000, they're looking on, and the cost to them is, what the fuck? Where is this going? Um, and if we add civil disobedience so that there's an edge, so, you know, it's like you said earlier, it's not rocket science. It's not that complicated.
And then if
Uh,
we add on top that we're not just going to the mall or to a building, but we're then focusing on the individuals and the corporations that are profiting.
yeah,
Because I think there's been a lot of analysis of fascism. And what people say is mass demonstrations are not an effective counter to fascism because they don't care what the majority think. What disrupts fascism is disruption. It's when the system doesn't work, when they can't deliver what they want. So I think this is really a challenge on how we get really strategic on who some of the bad guys are, and then ways that we can make them feel the pain that they're making us feel. And
mhm,
to me, as long as they can do all this crazy stuff and then sort of be off in their luxury resorts, for example, in New York City, a number of community groups have regularly gone out to Long Island, to the Hamptons regularly. They block the airport, the golf courses. Like, the rich have to feel on every level that they cannot maintain what they have on if this goes on. And so it's like there's both strategy and how to cost them money, but also their resorts, everywhere they go, they got to feel the anger of people who are losing their jobs, of an economy that's going to be in turmoil. But more importantly, even if the economy stabilized, it's the level of inequality, the way the rich dominate
yeah.
is just unacceptable
The,
to folks.
on the one side, there's what they can gain now. They have that firmly in mind, even sometimes fictitiously, but still firmly in mind. On the other side, there's the threat of a serious wealth tax. If it appears that their actions are increasing the likelihood of a serious wealth tax, that's a reason to stop the actions. If their actions are annoying you and I, they don't give a shit. So, and if their actions are immoral, they don't give a shit. And if they're,
Exactly.
because they don't even know what that means, much less,
Yeah, I
it's,
think we can't even use the word immoral. They're amoral. It's
yeah,
they.
yeah.
And there's actually, I don't know if you've read this fascinating brain research about how the brains of the super rich get rewired and they lose empathy. There was even a study done on people who win the lottery, and they
Did you,
soon convinced themselves they won the lottery because they deserve to win it and
because of
understood.
course. I'm
And
brilliant.
yeah, and so the ability of the human mind to rationalize the most outrageous behavior, and they're not, as you said earlier, they're not going to change because we go, tut, 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 you're unfair, you're immoral. They're
Yeah.
going to change because it materially impacts them, because all the things they care about are impacted. That's what changes them.
I'm not sure I have it right that it was Musk, but one of them said the problem that we're trying to deal with and overcome, the problem that is wrecking America, blah, 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 is empathy.
Yes, I think
See,
Musk has said it, but the whole set of right wing trolls have sort of taken this up, and it's almost like a Saturday Night Live skit. Like
it's
if we
incredible. You can't satirize them.
exactly, no, that's
You
exactly
can't.
right. If we had run a campaign saying rich people feel no empathy, they would have said, "Oh, there goes the radical left." But then they had
Yeah,
because empathy does mean that you care when you do something horrible, and so they are, you know, they can send. I don't know if you're following this case in Maryland of the guy who was deported into El Salvador. It's now been proven that the administration's admitted, and they say, "Well, tough luck."
right.
I mean, that's not just empathy. That's not just immoral. That's like craven and disgusting.
But you know what? When the administration at Columbia says okay and kneels, I don't think it's important that it makes me angrier, but in a very real sense it does. It's because they haven't been that way for years and years and years. Not that bad. They've been, who they are, but the extreme, it's like a profile in hypocrisy and cowardice, right? Instead of a profile in courage. And I don't know whether people are seeing it or not, but it's really
So
incredible.
one of the things to help people see it that we're starting to work on is doing a deep dive of who are trustees or regents on major universities and which ones of them, either through political contributions or their businesses, are sort of part of the Trump Musk defund universities. And we want to run campaigns that say it's a violation of fiduciary duty. You should not be allowed to be a trustee of a
Right,
university if you're
right.
advocating policies that defund it. And then we should look at what businesses they own, and we should go to those businesses and say, like we need to keep connecting the dots because this is
Yeah.
about money for them.
We did that like 50 or 60 years ago too, but I think if you do that, you're going to see a change at the universities. Whether or not it's true of all kinds of other institutions, I'm not sure. But at universities, you're going to see what you said earlier was the outcome of the change. The outcome that you said was, well, the universities basically are, gatherings to make money and to have power and influence in society. And as a kind of a means to that end, they do some teaching, mostly
Exactly.
mostly teaching how to be a rich person and be a schmuck at the elite schools. All right. But how did that happen from 1969 to now? Because there was some striking the response to the support for Palestine from the authorities on campuses was much worse than the response to us um, opposing the Vietnam War. It was much more aggressive, and we were actually more militant. So it was on both sides. You'd expect the administration to be more militant then, but it wasn't. And they did have an inkling of, wait, this is a university. we have to have knowledge produced at this institute, and that's changed. And I think what you'll see is, I have no, this is pure hypothesis. You will see that the staffing of the administrative levels is far more corporate than it was, and likewise of the trustees. I
Oh,
mean,
that's absolutely true because we've looked at the trustees before. It's a who's who of millionaires and billionaires. In a place like New York, it's real estate folks. Um, and
and the few other voices are gone, right? The few that were more or less, caring people, they're out.
I think what's interesting about all of this is, sometimes it takes a crisis to expose something. But if we go backwards a little bit, back to Ronald Reagan, there's generally been a defunding of higher education in this
Yeah.
country,
Yeah.
especially in the public sector. And it's not just been about saving money. Reagan and other people were clear that they wanted college students to have to work so they couldn't protest all the time. So there
Yeah.
is a history going back to the 60s of of the right wing seeing universities as, what do you call it, citadels that produce activists. And so the
Yeah.
original defunding, which then led universities, oh, we don't have as much money, so now we need to raise money. Now we need
But
corporate
that was
loans.
part of the purpose, to
Yes,
raise the tuition to change the composition of the student body.
exactly. And then if you're a student, right. So to me, this is, I'm so glad you brought up sort of what happened in the 60s. This is the through line that started there, which
Yeah.
is how, and so it's just sort of extraordinary when you look at who the boards of most of these schools are. And, any one of these schools between its endowment and between the rich people on their board could have said, you know what, our mission is, it's learning, it's higher education, blah blah blah, however they define it, and we'll pay for it out of the endowment, or we're going to raise the money, but we're not going to be intimidated. And
Yeah.
um, it hasn't happened, and I
No.
think it's. But I think what it will do is, I actually think it's going to help many of us be more clear-headed going forward about who allies are and aren't, and that's important to do that. And at what point, today at Columbia, a number of students chained themselves to the fence, Jewish and Palestinian students, that you do start to see the seeds of people reacting to sort of what's going on in Palestine as being so over the top. Even people that are not necessarily, you're seeing in the Jewish community, even people that are not necessarily sympathetic to Palestinians, which is a whole separate story, are now saying, there was a great speech by a rabbi that said, I don't want to be a pawn, anti-Semitism to be a pawn of Trumpism. So I think all of this is going to play out, but you're going to see, I'm hoping that sort of as, as students come back before the end of the year, but as they come back next year, that we're going to see a level of activity among students that will be
Ah,
critical to the movement going forward.
see, now you said you were biologically and constitutionally uh, an optimist, right?
I did say that.
Yes. Uh, I think it's going to happen now in the next few weeks. I think students on lots of campuses are probably talking in dorms and in dining halls and whatever. What do we do now? And we're going to see what they come up with. And I don't, I think it's going to be large and militant. I certainly hope so. I can't explain in my mind why it wouldn't be.
But the other interesting thing to look at is how much students have organized into union student workers. So there
Right.
is already at UCLA, at many of these schools, that there already is, are unions of student workers, of graduate students. And last year there was a strike at Rutgers, which was the first strike that I know of at a university that included the full-time tenured professors and the graduate students and part-time lecturers. So I definitely think that one of the key places we're going to see this fight play out is in higher ed. And what's really exciting is, especially a union like the American Association of University Professors, they elected new leadership, and they are on the front edge of both defending students and Palestinian students and challenging all of this. So there's unlikely things develop in crises that you wouldn't necessarily think would happen.
I have a what may be a uncomfortable or a hard question. I don't know. If you look at labor and the labor movement, would you agree with me that nurses, public school teachers on campuses, along with the occasional union inspired by some sort of leadership, like, say, Sean Fain or something, are where it's at for the moment? And if so, why is that?
Well, so having just come back from a big meeting in Chicago last week where we had hundreds of people, there's no doubt that teachers, nurses, a set of those kind of workers are in the forefront. And I think there's one, that's a result of really good organizing. Over the last 10 years, teachers have really organized, and a lot of it through something we call bargaining for common good, where
But you're just
teachers.
pushing the question back. Why were they the ones to organize really well, right? It's the
But
same.
I'm saying there's partly part of the reason is the attempts to defund the public sector and all of that
Oh,
have
okay.
given people an incentive.
Okay.
And what's really been good though is that what teacher unions have done all over the country is, instead of what they used to say, which is we're going to lose our jobs or we need more money for our pay, what they've fought about, what the Chicago teachers and other unions have fought about, is what we call bargaining for common good, bargaining and striking over questions of how do we get more housing for people, how do we have community schools, how do we do all those things. So there's like 10, 15 years of work laying out that teachers have really made themselves the advocates for the poorest and most disadvantaged students. But I definitely, and the reality in the labor movement, if we do the numbers, in 1958 or 55, depending who you ask, 35% of workers in this country were in unions, almost all in the private sector. We are now down to 6% of the private sector being organized and down to 10% of the workforce. So the private sector is a smaller and smaller part of the labor movement. And this is also by design, that there was an attempt that was largely successful starting in the 70s to destroy private sector unions and to eliminate their pensions. And then when you eliminate the pensions for private sector workers, you then say, well, why do those greedy public sector workers get pensions? So a lot of this are things that were set in motion and by design. But you also are seeing a lot of activity among logistics workers, Amazon workers. You're seeing lots of activity among other workers, but that has to be one of our jobs. That this
Right.
cannot just be a teacher and nurses movement. That so for example, we have a campaign called Tennessee for All in Tennessee that is about both organizing in rural areas, doing the prep work to help workers join unions in the new factories. But on top of that, we have a vision of what the state should look like that's different. And this isn't necessarily glamorous work, but you raised rural stuff earlier. If we don't organize in rural areas, we can't win. So I think
Right.
in some ways, we need to think about two things that may seem like the polar opposite, but they're the same. One is, what a dramatic, inspiring things that get people over their fear. And then also, what is the nitty gritty, deep work we have to do to build our movement? What are the places where there's huge cuts and there is no organization? And how do we go and how do we build in that? So I think it's like there's no secret here. There's no sort of gimmick that's going to win. But so we need to both look at what we're doing that inspires folks and starts to put the heat on the bad guys, and then we need to dig in on what that unions have really not tried to organize in the private sector for years. They've given up, and so all of those things have to happen at the same time.
It's it's a good session, and I think it's an important session. The kinds of things that you're saying need to be heard. It was interesting when you were talking about the schools. There's another upshot of, I mean, the '60s were, it had its virtues, but it didn't win. And you don't want to fight the power and not win. Because if you fight it pretty substantially and you don't win, when it's all said and done, they take it out and try to prevent it next time. And for a little bit of what you've been describing, the attack on private sector unions, the attack on higher education, et cetera, um, they all were basically the other side trying to avoid another '60s and worse from their point of view. And the impact of that is really quite striking in higher education in the United States. Doctoral level education, the composition, especially at the so-called more elite schools, um, is Asian, European. The amount of people from the United States there has declined drastically. And when you ask why, the teachers will tell you the American students who are applying are not prepared. They can't cut it. And so we take the students who can. So that's the result. But I think that too is almost conscious. That
Oh,
is, they're policies with respect to education aren't just shock and awe. Their policies are also uh, ignorance, let's call it, or denial of access to information, to debate, to discussion is good for us, meaning good for them. And so they're imposing that too.
I
Um,
mean, we shouldn't underestimate. I mean, I think what's interesting is the bad guys, the billionaires, the Trumpians, all of that, they understand better than we do that the
yep,
neoliberal regime is collapsing.
yep,
And we haven't really talked about that here, but neoliberalism, which has dominated, which led to so-called free trade, et cetera, is collapsing and it's not working. And part of the problem is much of the Democratic Party and the so-called progressive world was actually, and this happened throughout the world, social democratic parties all supported the austerity of neoliberalism and lost the working class because
yep.
they supported austerity. And part of that was and so the whole question of, when you think about like, what is student debt up to 2 trillion or $1.5 trillion, all of that's by design, as you're saying, to make it harder to go to school, limit who goes to school. But if you go to school, you have so much debt, you don't have any time to protest because you're working two jobs. I mean, that literally, there are quotes from Reagan talking years ago about, yeah, they shouldn't just be able to go to school for free. I mean, higher education was essentially free in this country, in in public universities for years. And so it's like part of our job is to help people understand that these are not accidents. This isn't the natural course of history. These are really, really wealthy people that want to get richer by implementing things that make them richer that hurt all of us. And I think we can tell that story in a non-ideological way without leftist rhetoric because that's people's experience. And we need
Yeah.
to talk about people's experience. And I just throw on top of that is, you know, they ran on they're going to stop inflation, and so I think we also have to, the other thing that we need to be really focused on is the material conditions, how this is impacting people and how we're talking about that, not that it's just bad, but how it's going to get fixed if we do things right. So I guess, I keep coming back to, and we're coming up towards Passover, that for me, this question of us having the courage, which I don't think we've had on the left for a long time, to say we want to go to the promised land. We want something dramatically better. That we've lost that. We've become so practical that what we say we're for, you know, 2 more sick days. I'm all for sick days. I'm all for all of that. But if I go to one more meeting where I'm meeting with nonprofits and other organizers and they say we're on the edge of fascism, let's do more of what we're doing, is our side has to get shaken up a little bit and say if we and that was the title of the article in these times, which is for labor caution is fatal, the biggest risk is something like maintaining the same thing. Folks should read the article. If you look up Stephen Lerner, fatal, in these times, it will pop up. Is that I guess we're running towards times. I think this is the critical question for the labor movement that we have to decide at every level. Are we going to try to, and I think this is how I end the article, are we going to gamble that Trumpism will collapse and we will revive ourselves from a diminished form? Or are we going to say, we're not afraid to poke the bear? We're not afraid of the consequences. We have no choice but to get into this fight full bore, to take the risks that come with it, because the risk of doing nothing is far greater than any consequence of aggressively organizing and fighting back.
We agree. And hopefully it's emerging. We'll see, I guess, in the coming weeks and maybe months, uh, what transpires. Uh, I'm tempted to just keep going on because it's I think it's so productive. But we've done the hour. Maybe the way to go on is to say we'll have you back again. What
Sure.
would you think about? I could imagine the next time, a few weeks down the road or a month or two down the road, again, talking about what's going on and what opportunities are there to fight and so on. But also, you made a point of, and I agree, that it has to be seeking more than to return to Biden, to return to business as usual pre-Trump. That's not going to motivate people. That it's and rightly so. So then the question becomes, how do we enunciate something other than that that represents really going forward? Maybe we could talk about that next time too.
That would be great because I think part of the challenge is how we balance a vision of what we want with a strategy that people feel lets us start to march down that road. And I
Right.
think that's really the challenge for us. That you
Right.
have to mesh; they feed off of each other.
Yeah. How do you talk about the present and what we're fighting for in a way that leads toward something much better, something much more inspiring, etc., and doesn't come across as lunacy? Um, all those things at once, not easy. I've been encountering them for decades. Well, anyway, I want to thank you, and I will get back in touch with you to do this again. And if there's anything you want to say before we close,
I would
now's
just end with sort of summarizing what I said, which is let's get out of the fetal position. Let's stop being afraid. Let's stop feeling this is some kind of colossus that isn't beatable. These are flawed, billionaire, whiny clowns.
yeah,
And if we get our act together and do what we need to do,
we
we're going to
will
see,
win. Yeah,
and we will win. And we'll win
yeah,
something much better than the past. We'll win the future. That's how
yeah.
I'd end.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
that said, this is Mike Albert signing off for Revolution Z. Until next time.